Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Library of Congress webinar on uncertainty and loss, the impact of the pandemic. My name is Sahar Kazmi, and I'll be moderating this morning's event. To get us started, please welcome the Chief Medical Officer at the Library of Congress, Dr. Sandra Charles.
Thank you, Sahar, and good morning to everyone. After more than a year of disruption, the current COVID-19 pandemic is still revealing new characteristics and manifestations. The pandemic has made the world much more acutely aware of the impact of grief and loss on daily life. In fact, by July of last year, what was described was the echo pandemic of suicide and mental illness. So the extraordinary nature of this virus and its rapid and far-reaching impact has created unparalleled havoc in almost every aspect of life. Multiple waves of outbreaks have battered the psyche and created much anxiety and stress. These being some of the primary mental health impacts that we have seen, along with exacerbation of pre-existing conditions of depression, isolation, loneliness, PTSD, and the loss of connectedness required by social distancing and having to quarantine or isolated has just made this much more of a severe problem. We are seeing some hope with the advent of vaccines, but there's continuing despair with the rising numbers in certain areas of cases and deaths. And of course, along with this have been several traumatic events that have really had an impact on people's sense of security. Not the less of which has been the January 6th incidents here on the Capitol Hill, as well as multiple problems in terms of conflict with law enforcement and several groups. So we have a lot of trauma with COVID-19 as well as with surrounding events. Today's event will help us to deal with all of these stressors and help us to develop coping skills that have been severely tested throughout this time. Coping skills that have sometimes been not the most healthy because it has led to overuse of alcohol and certain opioids and other drugs. So we are looking today to our speaker, Ms. Sullivan, to give us some guidance on all of this, help us to get some resilience. I'm turning it over now to Dr. Tomoka Steen, who will introduce our speaker for today. Thank you.
Next slide, please. So it's my pleasure to introduce. Oh, you had a slide on the introduction, but it is my pleasure to introduce Miss Melissa Selberg. And there is an introduction handout you will receive, but she has a long track record of the wonderful support she gave to a variety of populations from different age groups. And you will hear some interesting hints and how to cope with all these difficulties. And she is the expert. So I'd like to give more time for her speech. So I just give the floor to Ms. Selberg. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here with you all today. I am home, which is 12 blocks from the actual Library of Congress. So I am in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, and there are kids at play and some construction happening. And I have 4 fourth graders downstairs virtually learning. So I am living life in this moment. And so I apologize for any background noise. I am a licensed clinical social worker by training, and I work at the Wentz Center for Loss and Healing, which I'll introduce to you in just a minute. But I want to tell you a little bit about the journey we're going to go on today, so that we can make sure you know what to expect, and that where we're hopefully going to end up with ample time, of course, for some questions. We're going to be talking about grief and trauma. The past year plus, about 14 months, almost 15 months at this point, we've been living in a collective grief experience. And so we are really going to be framing this past year plus through the lens of grief and trauma. The events in January, on January 6th to be specific, highlighted the traumatic nature of what's happening right across from where you all work and right down the street from where I live. And so we'll be talking about not only that as a trauma experience, but just what Dr. Charles mentioned with the continued impact of racism, white supremacy, and oppression on our communities of color. And how that impacts the health outcomes, specifically related to COVID. So we're going to really marry grief and trauma and talk about the impact it has on us as humans and what we can do to sustain ourselves. So we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So as we talk about this, I mean, I'm a grief and trauma therapist, so I live in this world for, at least 5 days a week, if not longer. And so I tend to be fairly comfortable with these topics. And my husband and parents like to remind me regularly that the average person is not, and that I can, shut down a dinner conversation pretty quickly when people ask what I do. But I wanted to name that as we talk about these things, you might notice your body having a response. And that's okay. It's because your body's giving you information about the experience related to this conversation. And so as you notice that your body's having a reaction, either through a tight stomach, or maybe your chest getting tight, or your hands getting sweaty or cold, just notice it and do some things to tend to yourself. There's 4 examples here on the screen. If you're a parent of any age child, probably 3 and up, these work with young people and adults as well. But you can, of course, taking a breath is a great way to kind of reground yourself. The exhale is super important. I always have water, either warm water or ice water next to me, and taking a sip of water and actually tracking how that goes down when you swallow it can bring you back to present. And then the easiest thing to do is to look up from your screen and name 3 things that you see around you. Our brains are wired to scan for safety. That's how we have evolved over the centuries that we have been alive as humans. And so we scan the horizon for safety. And when we can't do that, our brains start to click into safety mode. And when we're on a Zoom box and we're staring into the computer or the tablet or your phone for periods of time, your brain gets confused. So just looking up and noticing 3 things that are around you can be a great way to reground yourself. Little tip for meetings as well. All right, we can go to the next slide. So why have we been talking about this? Since last March, I've been talking to a lot of schools and agencies and government agencies and nonprofits about the experience that people have been having in response to COVID. The Went Center, we're a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., and we focus solely on grief, loss, and trauma. We've been around for 45 years, and our founder, William Went, founded what was then known as the St. Francis Center, and we renamed it in the early 90s in his honor. But he was working with folks who were bereaved, who were grieving, and he noticed a common factor. He noticed that people who were grieving felt a sense of isolation. And that's because those around them didn't know what to say. They were worried about making the bereaved uncomfortable or reminding them of the fact that this death or loss event had happened, so they said nothing. And so he wanted to reduce that sense of isolation. And as Dr. Charles said, what we've been experiencing over this past year is a collective grief experience where we've had a heightened sense of isolation because of the physical distancing requirements. I have not been in my office since March 13th with my colleagues, and I miss seeing them dearly and having those spontaneous conversations. And I'm sure that some of you can relate to that. And we'll talk about the pain and the joy and that coexistence as we move through our time together. All right, so let's jump in. Let's go to the next slide and let's start talking about what this is. I like to start by naming that these are not normal times, right? You are not just working and parenting and caregiving and existing. You are living during multiple crises trying to work. And I feel at this point, it's really important to be saying this because we've passed the year mark. We're now at the end of April, right? We're heading into month 14 of living in this existence. And people tend to think we should know how to do this. We should know what we're doing. We should have this under control at this point in time. And things are changing so rapidly with the evolution of the health nature of this pandemic, with the pandemic related to racism and oppression, with climate change, with the political stuff that's been happening over the past year. Things are changing so rapidly that we constantly are readjusting and recalibrating. So this is not normal times, and you are not just doing these things. You are living and trying to survive multiple crises while trying to work, all right? So let's go to the next slide, and let's talk about why I believe this is a grief experience. So the simplest definition about grief is anytime there's a change with a loss, we have a grief experience. Change plus loss equals grief, okay? And I want you to reflect on some of the changes that you've experienced over the past year, right? I mentioned I'm a mom to two elementary school children, and one of the things that I am grieving is my loss of routine and role clarity. I used to walk from my house to their local elementary school, drop them at school, and then walk to Union Station, get on the metro, and commute on the red line up to my work. And if the red line was functioning well, it was 20 minutes from the time, I dropped my kids off and I walked out the metro door to head to my office. So right now I have no transition period. My transition is walking out of my bedroom where I sit today through a door that does not lock into the rest of my house, which is now a 4th grade classroom. So there's no transition, and there's no role clarity where I'm a working person and then I'm a mom. I am all of it all at the same time. And then a short order cook sometimes, because you got to cook lunch, these 3 meals a day, right? And so I want you to reflect on some of the things that you are missing in your over the past year. For many of us, we haven't had the opportunity to say goodbye as well, right? We left on March 13th expecting to be home for maybe 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, maybe 6 weeks. And many of us haven't seen our colleagues in over a year. And some of those colleagues have transitioned to other jobs. Some of them might have died. Some of them might have moved out of the area. And so we haven't had the opportunity to say goodbye. And the same is true if you have children as well. Right? They left school and didn't have a chance to say goodbye to their classroom and their teachers and the building and their friends. And so there are a lot of things that have changed over the course of this year that are a loss experience. I also want to say that it's also been a trauma experience. And so our definition of trauma is anytime there's a threat with no control, we have a trauma experience. And so what we've experienced both on January 6th, as well as recently when Officer Evans was killed, we're experiencing threats to what is your work environment and what is my neighborhood, right? Where we feel this lack of control and our sense of safety is rocked. And that may be happening as well with COVID, where we think about our ability to control our environment and to keep our families safe. How do we do it when this invisible threat is out there and we don't know who has it or when and if we're going to be exposed? So these two experiences can heighten our sense of safety within our bodies, and it puts our brains kind of on high alert, and it can cause us to have some responses, which we're going to talk about. So I just want you to reflect, and you can take a minute, you can jot them down, you can share them in the chat if you want to, some of the things that have changed for you. Because it's helpful for you to see that the experiences we've had over this past year actually do add up to a grief experience, okay? So let's talk a little bit about where we are in the pandemic at this point in time. And so we've hit pandemic fatigue, right? I don't know about you, but I've heard from my neighbors that they're done, they're over it. They just want to go back to normal. And so I've framed this with a couple of words up here, and some of these might resonate with you. The word ambiguity, we're going to talk about in a minute, so I'm going to come back to that one. But many of us are exhausted, physically exhausted, emotionally exhausted from the experience over the past year. from knowing that we have had to stay on hyper alert and we've had to learn more about this illness and learn more about what's happening to the science and what's happening around us. We've had to adjust to new working environments, to doing our job virtually, to helping our children engage in school virtually, to connecting with family virtually, to having social relationships virtually. And all of this is exhausting. There's a wonderful article in the New York Times about languishing. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend you read it because it really spoke to just about everybody I know who wrote it. And this idea that we are in the middle between being really okay and depression. We're kind of languishing in this period of time, right? We've also had this intense desire to return to what was. And what I want to name here is that as the news media and social media talks to this return to normalcy, when we've experienced a grief event, we don't go back. Our lives, our environments, our sense of selves are changed because we have lost something. And so we don't go back to what was, we go forward into a new existence. And if any of you have experienced the death of somebody important in your world, you know that your lives are forever changed because that person is no longer physically present. So we don't go back to what was, we go forward into this new existence. And I don't know what that is going to look like as we start to be able to drop masks outside and vaccination rates go up and we talk about boosters and returning to work. All of that, figuring out what is to come can heighten our sense of anxiety, right? So we have this anxiety related to the uncertainty of what is to come, all right? I want to circle back to this ambiguity a little bit because ambiguity is this existence that so many of us have been living in for such a long period of time, right? Ambiguous loss is a type of grief. And it's when there's a lack of certainty or a lack of clarity around the existence, around the loss event. With COVID, we've had a lot of ambiguity about decisions we've had to make. Are we making the right decisions? Do we go back to work in person? Do we go to the grocery store? Do we go on vacation? Do we see our loved ones? Do we send our kids to school and to camp? We've had a lot of questions that have a lot of weight to them. And as we're living in this ambiguity, it can cause our minds to get a little bit confused and it can lead to that exhaustion. What happens with grief is it doesn't often live in the verbal parts of our brain. It often lives in those nonverbal parts of our brain. And it can be hard to put words and language to what we're experiencing, which is why I often work with images when I'm working with people. So I've got a picture on the next slide that we can pull up. And I just want you to take a minute and notice what comes to mind for you. What does your body tell you when you see this image? What does your mind tell you when you see this image? And just take a minute and notice that. Sorry, there's some sanding happening across the street. What you might notice is that there's a lot of fog. There's a lot of cloudiness happening here, right? We can't really see the other side. We don't know, is that person on the bridge coming towards us? Are they moving away? What does the other side of this bridge look like? Who made this bridge? I see one rope, but I don't know what's the stability factor with this bridge. If the bridge breaks, how far does it fall? 5 feet, 500 feet? We're just not sure. To many people, this image brings about ambiguous loss. This kind of illustrates ambiguous loss and ambiguity for them because we're not sure what's on the other side, but we know we need to walk out onto that bridge. And if you're leading, if you're supervising, if you're leading a department, if you're raising children, if you're caring for people, you're telling them, come across that bridge. I have no idea what's on the other side, but we've got to go anyway. So there's a sense of anxiety and uncertainty that can come with taking those first steps. For others, this next picture resonates. So we can pull up this one. And you'll notice here we have some sort of race happening. There's a team. It appears to be a team. They're all wearing blue. And they're all attempting to go over these hurdles of varying heights. When I work with groups of people, I'll ask them, what do you notice? What comes to mind for you? What does your body say? And words come up like, no way, exhaustion, really hard, how can I do this? I don't want to do this, feels overwhelming. The hurdles of different heights can represent our grief, right? For some people, they're like that guy in the front who sails over it, no problem. For other people, they're just throwing themselves over the hurdles however they can. And others are going under the hurdles. And yet others are like in the back, I don't even know if I can go over this hurdle, right? The other thing I want to mention is how privilege plays into this. You'll notice that this guy in front has obviously had training and he has the athletic ability to go over those hurdles efficiently and effectively and safely. And the folks behind him don't have that. So he's had the privilege to have that training. He has access to the training, the money to pay for the training, and he has the innate physical ability to do it, right? Others don't have that. And then you'll notice who's not even on the course, right? This appears to be a predominantly white, if not all white team. So who's not even welcome on the course? So our privilege or our oppression impacts how we navigate this pandemic, right? And so we have to name that as well, that there are other factors that are impacting how we show up and engage in the public health part of this pandemic as well. And so understanding that members of your team and your family might be viewing these obstacles that COVID and the other pandemics present in different ways is really important to help build compassion, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. So I want to talk about some sticky feelings in grief, because very often we think about grief just being something that we endure or we get over or we move through. And what we know is that we need to learn to live with the grief that we've experienced, right? And there are some common feelings that show up in our grief experience that can cause us to get stuck in our grief. And that's why we call these three feelings our sticky feelings. It involves guilt, anxiety, and anger. I want to highlight the anxiety and the anger. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the guilt, and then I'm going to go closer into the anxiety and the anger. But guilt is a very common feeling that we experience when we're navigating grief. It can come up with the if only thoughts. If only I had made the phone call. If only I had picked somebody up. If only I hadn't done X, Y, and Z. And those if only thoughts make a lot of sense because our brain is trying to wrap its head around what has just happened and figure out if we could have prevented this horrible thing from happening. Guilt can also show up when we start to have moments of joy, right? So when we start to have those first moments of joy, we can feel like we're dishonoring the memory and the guilt process because we're not grieving enough. And we're going to talk in a minute about how pain and joy coexist. So guilt is a very normal experience in grief, and we need to get it out of our heads so that it doesn't get bigger, right? There's this story and this narrative in our heads, right? And so we need to share it with somebody. We need to share it with somebody who can hold that space for us and not try and fix it. And if you don't have a human who can do that, I'm telling you, four-legged friends, pets, dogs, cats are beautiful for this because they don't try to fix it. They just hold that space. But I want to talk about anxiety because anxiety is something we are noticing at the Went Center is heightened across our staff, with our clients, and with the families that we work with. Folks their central nervous systems are activated. They are trying to navigate safety and and find a sense of safety, right? Our anxiety gets heightened anytime we try to control the uncontrollable. The minute we realize that we can't control something, our anxiety kicks in because it thinks, oh my goodness, holy cow, I'm not actually in control. And so our anxiety gets amplified. And what that happens is that our thinking brains actually go offline and they don't help us make good decisions. So we need to actually calm our central nervous systems so that we can get our thinking brains back online. And we can do this through mindfulness, through breath work. And again, as I said in the beginning, the exhale and taking a breath is what actually activates that part of our central nervous system. It's called the parasympathetic nervous system that helps calm us down. So taking a slow breath in for a count of 4, and then a slow breath out for a count of 6. That can work really well to calm our central nervous systems. As can mantras, finding a piece of scripture or a prayer or a song or a poem or an affirmation or something that's very short that brings you back to present. But anger has been present as well. And I would imagine many of you are feeling heightened anxiety and anger given the proximity of your workplace to what happened back in January and the fact that the National Guard is still so present down on the Capitol. And so understanding that anger is a common experience when it comes to grief. We get angry that something's happened, right? And that anger has a place. And it is a valued emotion in the grief experience. But we need to get it out of our bodies, because if we don't get it out of our bodies, it takes up a lot of space, and it becomes kind of like shaking a can of seltzer or soda and then opening it, and the soda explodes all over us. So the easiest and fastest way to release the anger inside us is through exercise. Jumping jacks, push-ups, holding a plank, all of those can physically release the anger that's inside of us, as can advocacy and getting involved to try to make a tangible change in your community. I see a lot of folks with their grief try to turn that into action, right? And so understanding that these are common, and we just need to find strategies to work with them. But I want to go back to this idea of breakthrough joy when you're grieving. And so we often experience this back and forth in grief. So many of us as adults think that grief is all crying, all upsetness all the time, and that's the way we should be grieving. And what we know is that actually pain and joy coexist. So we've got the pain elements, crying, longing, remembering, and the joy elements, which is the laughter, the socializing, the setting new goals. And if you think about COVID, there are things that we intensely miss: commuting to work, transitions, engaging with our colleagues, spontaneous conversations, collaborative work, lunches in the cafeteria, right? We miss those. And then there might be things we actually enjoy: more connection with our families, not having a commute, being able to not put shoes on, right? I haven't worn real shoes in months. Being able to do this in my bare feet, wearing blue jeans, knowing I'm going to go downstairs and have lunch with my daughter and her friends after this. So there are elements that bring us intense pain, and there are elements that bring us joy. Pain and joy coexist. It's not either or. And so I just want you to reflect on what has brought you some pain in this experience and what has brought you some joy, and give space and room for both of those, right? So just as we name that there's this back and forth, there is no right and wrong way to grieve. And so I want to talk a little about the styles of grieving, because what happens is we get into this, if we don't understand the way people grieve, we get into this narrative of you're grieving wrong, you're not doing this right. And that breeds disconnection rather than a lack of compassion. So as I talk about this, I want you to think about which style of grieving you lean more towards. And if you live with people, which style they might lean more towards, okay? On the one end of the spectrum, we have our intuitive grievers. I call these our feelers. We, and I am one, we feel grief emotionally and somatically. Tears, lower energy, blinds drawn, trouble getting out of bed, quite emotional, right? You know they're grieving because you can feel it, you can sense it, and you can see it. Hollywood depicts grief this way, right? On the other end of the spectrum are our instrumental grievers. These are our doers. That does not mean they are not feeling. It just means that they process grief through doing, through physical tasks. These are the folks who plan the funeral, the memorial service, set up the meal train. They start the task list of who's going to do what. They set up the list of who's going to check in with what. They talk about cleaning out the office and who's going to do the jobs. They process through doing. And most of us fall somewhere in the middle, leaning one way or the other. But what happens is if we don't understand that this is a continuum, right, is our intuitive grievers start to have this internal dialogue about our instrumental grievers of, why aren't you sad? Somebody died. You should slow down and be grieving. Don't you have any emotions? Why are you so cold-hearted, right? And our instrumental grievers start to think about our intuitive grievers. Why are you being so selfish? This isn't about you. Get up. There's things to do. There's other kids to care for. There are families to help. There's jobs to do. And so this breeds disconnection at a time when we need connection and compassion, right? So understanding that we all grieve a little bit differently is really important so that we can create space for others to bring their grief experience into our communities and into our lives, right? Because we want to be breeding that connection and compassion that I'm going to be talking about. So just as you can have thoughts and feelings about others, You might have this internal dialogue happening, right? We all have automatic thoughts. And I want you to think about what some of your automatic thoughts have been. I'm a runner by nature. I run down to your office building every morning and do some loops. I used to run around the Capitol, but I can't do that anymore. And while I was running, this is when my brain did its best thinking. But I'm going to tell you, since the pandemic, I listen to books, audiobooks, because my brain just starts swirling with all of these automatic thoughts, and it became overwhelming. And I noticed an impact. So you might notice that you have automatic thoughts crop up throughout the day. They're automatic. We can't control their arrival, right? But we can certainly control what we do with them. So see if you relate to any of these thoughts. Others have it so much worse for me, right? I'm a grief therapist. I should be able to manage my feelings for sure, right? I have no other option but to keep going. How do I meet others' needs when I can't meet my own, right? So we can't impact and prevent the arrival of these, but we can impact what we do with them. And that's when we bring in compassion, right? So having compassion for ourselves and for others helps to calm that internal narrative so that we can have more grace and more compassion for ourselves. So when thoughts come up, you can notice, say, oh, there's that thought again, and take a breath and just notice the thought. You don't have to solve it. These are not thoughts with solutions attached to them. You can say to yourself, I'm bigger than my worry. I tell my kids to say that all the time. I'm bigger than my worry. I'm stronger than my worry, right? Or do some physical movement. So we can't control these thoughts from arriving, but we can certainly control how we respond to these thoughts and prevent them from swirling and ruminating and taking up more space in our brains, right? So let's talk about how we do this. We've talked a lot about grief and how this is a grief experience and some of what we might be experiencing with anxiety and anger and guilt and these swirling thoughts and styles of grieving. Now I want to focus on, so what do we do? Kristen Neff is a self-compassion expert. She's amazing. I recommend her reading and her website. She writes, this is a moment of suffering. Suffering is a part of life. May I be kind to myself. May I give myself the compassion I need. So notice she doesn't talk about the absence of suffering and difficulty. She talks about the response. So when we talk about resilience and we talk about compassion, we're not talking about the absence of hardship and pain, but we're talking about our response to that hardship and pain. And so we can soften that response so that it is framed within a lens of compassion. And right now, I know that it can feel overwhelming when you think about what you should do. So I want to frame some ideas with the word micro breaks. So back at the beginning of the pandemic on social media, I had a former colleague of mine talk about, if you're not using this time to reinvent yourself, you're wasting it. This was back in June of last year. And I thought, reinventing myself, holy cow, I can barely remember to brush my teeth in the morning. I've got to figure out how to do my job, how to be present for my kids who are home, how to exist, all of us in this small house, you know, how to talk to my parents who live far away and I couldn't see. And you want me to reinvent myself? And so I took a breath, and actually a colleague, held that space for me, and we took a breath together. And we decided to reframe how we were going to take care of ourselves in the term of micro breaks, because none of us had a whole lot of extra time, right? And so these are things that you can do to demonstrate some self-compassion for yourself in 2 minutes or less. I like to think about this along a continuum because I'm a very visual person, so I like images. I think about having, on the one end, we've got a release, right? On the one end, we need to release some of what we're holding from the news media, from social media, from our friends, from our family members, from our kids that they share with us, right? All that we take in, we need to release. And so some strategies that you can use to release some of what you're holding is to put on your favorite song, turn it up, and sing out loud. When you sing out, the repeating automatic thoughts can't can't gain space. They can't continue. Thoughts don't come in, stuff only goes out. So if you've got kids, if you've got family members, if you have neighbors, turn on the song. My kids love Hamilton, so we turn on a lot of Hamilton, we turn it up loud, and we sing at the top of our lungs. It's incredible how this is a release of all that we've held without having to even name what we're holding and what we've been exposed to. So that's a really active way of releasing. A more gentle way of releasing is to wash your hands mindfully. The next time you wash your hands, I want you to go to the sink, feel the water on your hands, really notice the temperature. Then put the soap on your hands, notice the suds, notice if there's a smell, really feel the soap in between your fingers. And then take one of those repeating thoughts, those automatic worries, something that's kind of repeating in your head, attach it to the soap and watch it go down the drain. You do, in the 30 seconds that you wash your hands, you do not need to be thinking about the next email, the next lunch thing you're going to make for lunch, the next phone call you have to make. You can reclaim those 30 seconds for yourself. So after you've released, either through singing or washing your hands, you need to renew, to restore. You can do that through listening to a guided meditation or taking a few deep breaths, by going outside and feeling the sun on your face, by watering plants, by taking a drink of water, by loving on a pet, right? Or if you have other people in the house that you are able to give a hug to, giving a hug and hold it for 20 seconds. 20 seconds is really key. And so we need to think about how we renew and restore, right? Because we want to reclaim these micro moments for releasing and for renewing. And we can't do this in isolation. So how do we connect with other people? And so I want to give you some tips and some hints here about connecting. Because remember, I said at the beginning that our founder really operated and did his work to try and help give people language so that they could connect with other people, because it's often makes us anxious about what to say. So the first thing is I want to tell you is that it's not what you say, but it's showing up. There is no solution, there is no fix, there is no answer for grief. We cannot solve that problem, right? With grief, the solution lies in somebody witnessing and tending to our pain, in somebody being present for us, and somebody validating what we are experiencing. And you know, if you've ever experienced a significant loss, it's the fact that somebody witnessed it and was present with you. They couldn't take that pain away, nor should they, right? They couldn't bring that person back, but they could help you feel less alone and more okay in the pain that you were feeling. And so this cartoon does this beautifully. It says, hey, you okay? And the blue blob says, no, not really. And the red blob says, want to talk about it? Because that's what we do. We ask questions, which is good, right? And the blue blob says, not really, because sometimes there are no words or it's exhausting to figure out how to put into words what we're experiencing. And the red blob does not just say, all right, did my job, check the box, on my way, and go on his business and say it's up to the blue blob to come find me when he wants to talk. No, he cozies up next to the blue blob and he's present, because it's our presence, it's companioning, it's being there that can help us feel less alone. If you've got children, and I'm assuming I'm talking to at least a couple of librarians, there's a great children's book called And the Rabbit Listened. It's amazing. I recommend it. And it talks about this in a picture book. Works really well middle school and on down. You can do a lot of great stuff with your kids about it and just read it yourself and notice our inclination to fix the problem, right? And that this is about being present. But when you do want to say something, you can say, you've been on my mind. I wanted to call. It's good to hear your voice, right? The key thing here is finding a way to greet somebody and connect without saying, how are you? That's my challenge to you. Drop the how are you, right? Because how are you is a loaded question, because we have to figure out, do you care? Can you hold the space? Are you really just asking that as a formality, or do you really want to know how I'm doing? And by the time I figure all of that out, like, you've moved on to another part of the conversation. So drop the how are you and just say what you really mean, which is, it's so good to see you. I'm glad you're here. Or ask a very specific question. How are you doing today? How are you doing this morning? What's going well today? What was difficult today? What's your view like? What are you looking at? What do you like about your workspace? What do you miss about work? What's been the hardest part? Is there any way that I can make your day easier now? Because this is about connecting. This is not about fixing. So think about it and challenge yourself to find a different way to say, how are you? The last thing I want to leave you with is the intentionality around transition. For those of us who are working from home, our transitions are kind of gone unless we think about them intentionally, right? I used to walk my kids to school. I used to commute to work. I would have this natural transition where I transitioned from one role to the next. And by the time I got home, I had transitioned into my role as mother, and I would change my clothes and I would go about my business, right? And so thinking about how we can bring about some new transitions is really important. So I want you, if you are home, I want you to think about putting your computer away, getting up and moving after meetings, about making sure that you close your computer at the end of the night and put it someplace else. My office is in my bedroom, so that white light of my computer charging just says, Melissa, get up and come do more work, right? So how can you give yourself visual cues that the workday is over and let your family know that the workday is over? If you're at work in person, I want you to use your commute. I want you to think about transitioning during the day, getting up and moving. And so think about how you can intentionally bring transitions into your day. This is really important for our brains to have some space from what we're doing. So you can visit our website. This is kind of you can go to the next slide, Sahar, thank you. Thinking about how you can continue this learning journey, because grief is a learning journey. You can go to our website. We've got some great tip sheets there. You can check out our information, and of course, take a look if you're interested in accessing our services as well, of course. But I wanted to leave. I could talk for hours about this, and I want to make sure that I leave time for questions that you might have that I haven't answered, or anything you want me to go back to. So if you've got questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, we did have one question come in. A person asked, how can I handle being a caregiver for my ill parent and working? Caregiving takes up most of my time. I'm not able to retire yet, and my performance and productivity is really suffering. I feel so nervous and like I'm on the verge of a breakdown.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for answering that question. It takes courage and vulnerability to do that. So I thank you. And it's hard. It's really hard. So the first thing I want to say is to give yourself some grace and some self-compassion. That we have never done this before. You have never cared for your older parents in a pandemic. You've never done this before. And so we're figuring it out as we go. So really focusing in on some micro moments where you can renew and restore yourself. So in the morning, thinking about setting some intention for yourself. What is your goal for the day? And make your goal realistic. Making sure that you identify ways that you're going to tend to yourself. Right? So making sure that throughout each hour, you're able to take 30 seconds, reset and restore, and say to yourself, I'm doing the best I can. And right now I need to focus on myself to get myself present so that I can help those around me. You know, I think your body is telling you that this is overwhelming. And so some really radical things need to be brought into your world to release what you're holding and to renew and restore. And so finding tangible ways throughout the day that you can take care of you. If it's, getting horizontal, I don't talk about taking naps, but getting horizontal for 3 minutes. If it's setting a calendar alert in your day for 15 minutes where you actually can take a lunch, sit outside, not answer email, and not check on your parents that you're taking care of, right? Finding ways that you can take care of you so that then you can be present for them. And when we're caring for elderly parents and we're in that kind of sandwich generation, right? You're living in a grief experience because you are grieving that the difference in the relationship with your parents. You are grieving what could be. You're grieving their role as you're transitioning into a new role. So giving yourself space to actually allow those feelings to be present, and that you don't have to be perfect at all of it, right? So it really is about recognizing self-compassion and recognizing ways that you can renew and restore yourself throughout the day. I'm not talking about a 10-mile bike ride or, meditating for 30 minutes or, starting a new hobby. I'm literally talking about 30 seconds where you say to yourself, I'm doing the best I can, and that's enough right now. And then doing some research to figure out what are some ways that you can bring in some extra help. Is it through external caregivers? Is it through tapping into those other resources? Is it saying to a friend, I'm really struggling right now and I need some support? And so that you can be honest with folks that this is really, really hard, so that you're not alone in that presence. And reaching out to your EAP as well. If you feel like you're towards a nervous breakdown and you're having anxiety attacks, it's really important that you reach out and get some professional help as well, so that somebody else can hold that space for you, just as you're holding that space for your parents. Hopefully that helped a little bit.
Thanks, Melissa. I have another question. Do you have any tips for coping with a partner who has a lot of fear of leaving the house, even after being fully vaccinated and going through the waiting period after their second shot? They seem unwilling to bear any amount of risk right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of anxiety out there, right? We've lived in this state for 12 months where we have been hunkered down, and people have said, if you go out, there's danger attached to it, right? Like, in the news cycle really amps up the anxiety. That's part of kind of how they get their ratings, right? And there's a lot of validity to exposure and needing to take care of ourselves and protect ourselves. And so the first is having presence and grace for you and your partner. The second is taking care of you. So if you need to go out, you go out and you expose yourself, you go out and expose yourself to the sunshine and to those. And the third is naming that this has been overwhelming for the past year. And so we're going to have to take some baby steps. We're going to have to really start re-entering the world at a pace that feels right for you. So perhaps it's going outside, fully masked, walking around the block and staying 6 feet from people and just noticing how your body feels in that. And when you see them taking those steps, say, I saw how much courage that took. That felt overwhelming, and you took that next step. And I see that, and I recognize it. So it's these baby steps back into society. There's a lot of anxiety around reentry. Reentry is a lot of our focus at this point in time. And so if you notice that they're getting anxious, you might ask them, how do they notice on their body that they're getting anxious? Is it increased heart rate? Is it stomach ache? Do they start to feel like they're being consumed by it, right? So noticing how your body is responding and taking some specific strategies to actually calm your body down through breath work, through journaling, through artwork about what could happen, kind of letting their brains go there and getting it out on paper and through art. And then slowly re-engaging through taking steps out and then coming back in. And if they're really paralyzed by it and you feel like it's becoming agoraphobia, which is that fear of leaving the house, you could talk to a professional about it. There are some studies out there that are happening now with the increase in anxiety and agoraphobia with response to returning. But I would say be patient. That for some people, that second vaccine 2 weeks later, they're going to be good to go. And for others, they're going to hear the stories about breakthrough and for, variants, et cetera, and they're still going to have anxiety. And so, moving at a pace that feels right for the both of you, and then making sure that your needs get met as well is really important.
Melissa, these weren't questions, but the slide with the hurdles inspired some feedback in our chat and our Q&A, and I just wondered if you could speak to a little bit more. One person said, hey, maybe that person in the front is actually a veteran and they have a special skill set that allows them to succeed right now. Another person said, I didn't notice any Black or non-white people in the photograph, which induced some feelings of anger, which you also noted, Melissa. Is there anything you can speak to a little bit more about privilege and success at this moment in time?
Yeah, I think it's important to name, which is why we talk about it with that slide in particular about being aware of how our privilege impacts how we navigate the pandemic. The Wall Street Journal did a great picture last spring when people were talking about we're all in this together, and it had boats in the ocean, and the ocean was stormy, and it had boats of different sizes. And so this idea of it's better to navigate it's easier to navigate a storm in the ocean if you've got a yacht with stabilizers and a helicopter that you can whisk away on and a pilot, all that kind of stuff, than if you're in a rowboat just with oars and you're navigating it by yourself, right? So how does privilege impact how we show up into this space? That awareness is really important, right? And you're absolutely right. We don't know where that person learned how to jump those hurdles. It could have been in the military. It could have been through going through a parkour class or at a gym. We don't know. And so making assumptions, of course, is absolutely dangerous, but being open and curious, right? So how'd you learn that? Is there a way that you can take that skill that you learned, however you learned it, and let's invite other people into the course? Let's expand that opportunity. And so I'm glad that folks noticed that they were having a response and that and wanted to name it. I think that's really, really valuable and important. And it's one that at the Wendt Center, we're cognizant of, and we like to name how our privilege impacts how we show up into the space and how it impacts how we're navigating a grief experience. Because we've known that racism, white supremacy, and oppression impact how people grieve, and it has for centuries. So it's very important to name. So I'm glad that folks named that.
Thanks, Melissa. Another person shared, I work 2 jobs and I'm a caretaker for my husband who is battling stage 4 cancer. Some days I feel sad, overwhelmed, and just so exhausted. Do you have any tips?
Yeah, I'm really sad to hear that you're navigating that. There's a lot on your plate and a lot that is sad. And so being able to name that sadness and that pain that you're in is really, it takes a lot of courage, because sometimes we feel like we just want to put our heads down and keep going, that we don't have time for the pain because there's so much to do. So again, I'm really sad and sorry to hear that you're going through that. You're absolutely right. Your responses make a lot of sense to me, that you would be feeling overwhelmed and exhausted. So what I would encourage is to find, different ways throughout the day, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, that you can pause for yourself, to take a breath, to wash your hands mindfully, to put on some soothing music, to tend to yourself. I would also encourage you to find a way to give yourself space to express those feelings that you're having. It's okay to not be okay. Megan Devine's an amazing author. She's got a great social media presence, and she wrote that book, It's Okay to Not Be Okay. It's a really great book on grief, and it's okay to not be okay, right? And then thinking about how you can find some support for yourself, either through a support group, through a network of caregivers, to give yourself space to be able to get the support that you need, and then invite somebody else in to provide some caretaking so that you get some respite. Because we're not designed to do 24 hours, 7 days a week. We need to be able to stop and tend to ourselves. And that does take a village and a community. So who can you invite in to be a part of your village?
Thanks, Melissa. Another question about caregiving. How can I take care of an elderly parent in another state outside of this area? I fear that I might bring infection back with me if I visit, but feel guilty if I don't visit.
Yeah, so I would encourage you to talk to a medical professional about the risk and really get some facts. Perhaps their doctor would be a great place to start, so that they would understand their own, your parents' medical conditions and what their risk is. So the first is we need to be existing in facts. So talking to a medical professional, which I am not, about that specifics around that case. The second is when we are separated from people that we love, it's about connection. It's about connecting to them emotionally with our heart and with our heads. So thinking about how you can use technology to Zoom with them, to connect with them over FaceTime, to write letters to them, to send them, if, you know, my parents are in their 80s and they text, so I'm able to send them text message throughout the day, just thinking about you. And then you might find some folks in their community who can step in and visit with them, right? But the first thing is to start with their medical doctors to assess the specific risk related to your family, so that you can make the most educated decision that's grounded in facts, and that will help calm your anxiety. Because we're always going to wonder, should I be doing this? Should I not be doing this? Am I making the right decision? We're going to second guess ourselves. And so it's real important that you get the facts so that you can make that best decision. And then have self-compassion for yourself. You're doing the best you can in this moment, and you don't have all the answers, and that's okay. And being open to your parents about that. I miss you. I want to come see you, and I'm nervous I'm going to bring something and infect you. And so I'm going to find out these answers, and I'm going to make it the best decision I can. Let's have a conversation about that. But just know that I really miss you, and I wish I could be with you. Sometimes hearing that is what we need.
Melissa, can you speak to the benefits of getting outside? A lot of people in the chat and Q&A have recommended taking walks, being in nature. Does that help?
Absolutely. I mean, there's science behind the impact of the sun on our serotonin levels. So being able to go outside, note, and what I would encourage you to do is to be present with yourself in that moment. Unplug the headphones, you know, try to stand there for 20 seconds and just notice how the skin feels on your face, on your body. Is it warm? Is it hot? Do you notice the hair on your body standing up? What do you hear? Really activate the 5 senses to be fully present in that moment, because being present in the moment will actually be restorative. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you feel? What do you smell? And then what can you touch? A leaf, a flower, touch your face after it's been in the sun. But that connection with outside is an amazing grounding factor and can be really restorative. So absolutely.
Marissa, thank you so much. Such a wonderful, presentation and sharing so many knowledge you have. I mean, you're amazing, actually. So those who didn't get, your question answered, please send us previous page. We had a address here, and just to put the note, April 27th event webinar. Then we will answer your questions. And thank you so much again, Marissa, and hope to have you again sometime in the near future.
Of course, it's my pleasure. Be well.
Thank you. And the next slide shows where we are going to have the web put up, and you can stay in touch with us, one of us, anytime directly. And I hope to see you again in person in the future. Thank you.